Ararat is a rural city southwest of Victoria, Australia. It is here, perched on a hill, formerly known as Madman's Hill, that an asylum was built, which is said to be one of the most haunted places in Australia. Okay, let's go. Now, if you haven't noticed already, dear mung beans, this episode is a little different this time, as my amazing better half, or co-host, is currently frolicking around Japan with his roommate, so I thought it was about time I pulled up my big girl pants and did an episode on my own. Or a spooky episode. Ooh. Originally named the Ararat Lunatic Asylum, later being renamed the Aradale Asylum, construction would commence in 1864, with the asylum treating its first patients in 1865. The asylum was built on 40 hectares, or 98 acres, to almost be a small self-contained town. It had its own market gardens, orchards, vineyards, piggery and other stock in the grounds. Oh, they even had their own morgue that they were able to, do autopsies and stuff and the like in there. At the peak of the asylum operating, it is said that over 500 staff were on hand and at one point up to 1,000 patients. It was a large complex consisting of around 64 buildings. At the time, 2 other sister asylums were also built at Kew and Beechworth to accommodate the growing number of, and this is me doing my quotey fingers, lunatics in the colony of Victoria. So you need to remember, don't come at me, but 1800s. This asylum had a few features that I'd never really thought about before. A few other early Victorian asylums would use this as well, and it was called a ha-ha fence. Yes, that is a thing, and it's also known as a sunk fence, blind fence, deer wall, and so on. So if you were like me, you are thinking, what the heck is a ha-ha fence? So I'm going to try and describe it the best way I can. One side, which is vertical and faced with stone or bricks, and the other side is sloped and turfed. So from the inside, the walls look tall to prevent people from escaping, and from the outside, the walls looked low to be less prison-like. Speaking of prison, the asylum would also start to house people who were detained in any jail, reformatory, or industrial school where the person appeared to be insane. This was called the J ward, and although it was never separate from the institution, it was always regarded as a temporary measure. By May 1988, it was announced that J Ward would be closed over the next year. You can also take a virtual tour of J Ward by visiting the Aradale website, and I'll link it in the notes. Little fact, or fun fact, Mark Chopper Reed was transferred to J Ward after arranging his ears to be cut off. He remained there for a few months before going back. There are a few stories that I found interesting when it came to J Ward, and I thought I'd share a couple of those with you now because I can. One of them is called Another Story for the Birds. So roughly in the centre of the backyard at the time, there was an aviary. They had some exotic birds in there, and the floor of the cages were sheet trays filled with sand to catch the bird droppings. So just a normal cage, as you will. One night the nurse was locking up, and one of the less devious patients slyly hinted that he knew something the nurses didn't. He was insistent enough that after they finished getting the other patients to bed, the nurses decided that they should try to find out what it was that he was hinting at. He finally let on that the others had been flexing the sheet metal edges of the dirt trays until they had broken off long slivers. The intention was next morning, after opening time, they were all going to race out to the yard, recover these jagged pieces of metals, and use handkerchiefs wrapped around the sharp metal as a handle and turn it into daggers, and kill the staff and escape. The nurse didn't say a word. She just made sure everybody was in bed, and when the place was settled for the night, she went out into the yard and released all the birds. The cages were smashed up and thrown outside the walls. In the morning, the would-be escapees raced out to the yard to arm themselves, only to find their chance had flown the coop. Another story is pumpkin soup. This one's very, very gross. In the early days of growing vegetables, there was a patient who was in charge of the pumpkin patch, but he was a J-ward patient, so a criminal. He pulled all of the flowers off the pumpkin plants except for one. He'd care for the plant, watered it, weeded it, fertilized it, kept everybody away from it. In the fullness of time, he grew a huge pumpkin. And when it was ripe, he took it to the cooks and asked if they wanted to make some pumpkin soup. The cooks were like, of course, no problem. Put it on the bench over there and we'll have it later in the week. The following morning, when the cooks came into work, the kitchen was filled with a rather overpowering stench. They checked their shoes to see, had they stepped in dog poo or had one of the dogs pooed somewhere. But then they realised the smell was coming from the huge pumpkin. The kitchen cleaver was brought into play and the offending item was split. It was only then they realised that the patient had cut the top out of the pumpkin, hollowed it out, and used it as a toilet for a week. No, thank you. So there you go, just a few little stories about J-ward, and I'll definitely link the website in the notes. Now back to the asylum. During the over 130 years of operation, it is said that there were around 13,000 deaths, which included patients, prisoners, and staff. And this would occur within the walls. However, officials would say the number was closer to 3,000. Now, we have to remember 1800s. Things that we would now see as mental health problems or even minor treatable problems would have been seen as insane. So this establishment actually saw thousands of men, women, and even children pass through the doors. John Kavanagh, who worked as a nurse educator for more than 2 decades, would state that it was a place that catered for both the intellectually handicapped person and for the mentally ill, and that it was challenging. Some of the patients would be deemed either too sick or too dangerous to remain in society. In Victorian times, it obviously would not have been hard to be diagnosed with some form of mental illness and be committed. And the scary thing was, it only took 2 signatures to get you committed, whereas to leave, it would take 8 signatures. Some of the diagnosis, people would be committed on postnatal depression, dementia, epilepsy, and so on. Given history, we know that there would be some rather questionable treatments used, including restraints and electroshock therapy. So the restraints would be restraining jackets or people who were thought to possibly harm themselves. They were told or had to wear these very rigid leather gloves. Other treatments included restraint bags, being strapped to chairs, isolation boxes, being forced to sit in hot or cold baths, and of course lithium was used on some patients because, hey, sign of the times. Aradale would close its doors in 1993. Due to the nature of the building and the history behind it and the mental anguish, criminals possibly holding a lot of hate, you could only assume a place like this would be haunted. And not only can you find a lot of videos online, and Joey, heads up, I think we should add this to our list, but some say that Aradale is the most haunted place in Australia. Is it up there with North Kapunda? From what I've seen, definitely, I think so. Ghost tours are available, and from these tours, visitors have have complained of feeling nauseous, some even fainting, and others experiencing sudden pains. There are also a few well-known ghosts to the property, and I'm going to go through a few of them now for you. So one of the first ones is Governor George Fidemont. George was actually the last governor of the jail. In 1886, he was showing a group around the jail, and as they were coming down the steps, just as they reached the bottom, he suffered a massive heart attack and died near the foot of the stairs. Tour guides have spoken of day tours happening when noises could be heard. It was the sound of someone walking up and down the steps, and it sounded like hobnailed boots. And I was like, what the fudge is a hobnailed boot? And it is literally shoes with like nails on the soles, but they aren't spiky. If you didn't know that, now you know. And Joey, I reckon you did know that, because it's like the sign of the times and the old times, and you like doing the old times. I love you, Miss Al. Another ghost would be Gary Webb. Now, dear mung beans, I want to warn you to maybe hold your bits, gents, but Gary had a long list of criminal activity, and he would be caught and sent to Aradale. He was sent to prison for 14 years for trying to rob a pizza shop when a police officer saw him, and he was shot, but survived, thankfully. Gary also shot the woman who owned the pizza shop, and she ended up in a wheelchair. Gary was told that if he behaved well, he would be out in 8.5 years. This man was something else, because he started to write to the media and politicians, and he just wanted to let them know what he would do when he got out of jail. I assume it was something horrific, because a special law was passed to keep him locked up for the rest of his life. But that's not where our story with Gary ends. No. Gary wasn't too pleased with that. So there are around 70, yes, 70, recorded incidents of Gary mutilating himself, cutting off bits and pieces, and he even cut his penis off 3 times, with the last time being too damaged to reattach. He cut his penis off 3 times? No. There are stories that Gary still haunts his former room, telling people to get out of here. Another haunting story is that of Dr. William L. Mullen, who died in 1912 due to suicide. And it is said that he haunts the superintendent's office because visitors have experienced a bitter taste while walking by his office. He died from swallowing cyanide. Although reports cannot confirm that the superintendent at the time was Dr. Mullins, but they assume it was him. Another well-known ghost is Nurse Kerry. She is said to haunt the woman's ward, or watch over, as she seems to do with the tour guides. When visiting the ward, plenty of people explain they felt nauseous and dizzy. Other accounts are seeing a figure in the woman's area, and others got a tingling sensation on one half of their head in one of the rooms, which turned out to be where they performed shock therapy. Outside of a few of the regular hauntings, there have been a lot of movement around J Ward. People feeling suddenly ill, slipping into trance-like states, being pushed and bitten, ticking clocks, bangings on the wall as if someone was banging their head, and of course electrical equipment seems to malfunction. It is also said that the ward is haunted by 3 prisoners who were hanged and buried at Aradale. Due to them being convicted of murder, they did not receive a Christian burial, and instead their graves were marked with 3 small scratches in the prison wall. In 2001, the Victorian government provided the Melbourne Polytechnic a few million to establish a campus on the site of the hospital. They have created a campus and a hospitality training facility, vineyard, lavender farm, and olive grove too. And that, dear mung beans, is the history of Aradale Asylum. And just another little thing to pop in, do not forget, if there is a true crime case you want covered, a cryptid or a spoop, make sure you reach out at linktree/winetime mysteries and hit the suggest a case. Tell us what you want covered, if you want a shout out, and who you want to do the case. And on that note, goodbye. Didn't think you could have outtakes when it's just you, but here's one of them. I'm a worthy girl. Speaking of prison, flown the queue. The queue? Finger bang bang, sign of the times. Now, Gary